You're not going to be any good in procurement if you don't understand the procurement cycle, especially since the procurement cycle is at the heart of purchasing, sourcing, and supply. Okay, real quick, what is procurement? Procurement is the strategic business function that identifies, sources, assesses, and manages the external resources that an organization needs to successfully fulfill its objectives. Now, the cyclic nature of procurement, the cyclic nature of procurement has the following stages. In fact, this is what is normally referred to as the procurement cycle. Number 1, understanding the need and development of a high-level specification. Number 2, the market or commodity options, including make or buy assessment, developing the strategy or a plan, pre-procurement market test and market engagement, development of required documentation such as the RFQ, basically the request for quotation, supplier selection to participate in an invitation to tender exercise, issue invitation to tender or request for quotation, then bid, tender or quotation evaluation and validation, and then contract award and implementation, warehouse logistics and receipt, contract performance review and continuous improvement, supplier relationship or contract management, and finally, asset management or basically end of life. Yeah, I get it. That seems like a needlessly complicated procedure for someone who just wants to buy a pen or someone who just wants to buy printing material for the organization. All right. But look, there are other alternatives. Like organizations tend to have framework agreements or framework arrangements which help them to avoid going through all that. But in this video, we're going to look at all those steps in detail. Stage 1, understand needs and develop a high-level specification. All buying activities stem from a need, which could be as simple as we are out of printing papers or as complex as a machine part that have to be custom made for our machine. Once the need is identified, then the procurement specialist, in this case you, should develop a specification. Whether it's performance or conformance specification, there is a need for you to work with relevant stakeholders when developing such. You see, the thing about specifications, think of it this. Let's say your organization, you want to purchase or rather you want to procure services. And in this case, you're talking about marketing services. And then you just think, well, we'll just go to Facebook and use Facebook to market, right? So develop pictures, you post them on Facebook and, whatever, you say we've done marketing, right? Except that wasn't really what the people who are developing products had in mind. What they wanted was a way to capture leads so that they can call and convert those leads. So in this case, you are assuming that they want awareness, but they are interested in capturing leads. And that is the reason why you need to involve relevant stakeholders when it comes to developing things like specification. And the same can be said about buying just anything, Buying an item, buying printing papers, buying machine parts. The point is, it's not a one-person show, You have to involve the relevant stakeholders. Speaking of specifications, there are two kinds of specification, broadly speaking. The first one is performance specification, which specifies what the product or service will do or achieve, but leaves the supplier the freedom to achieve this however they wish. The second one is conformance or technical specification, which is one that gives clear instructions to the supplier about what is required and how it should be achieved. For instance, technical drawings they could or they have to comply with. Now remember, you have a need, This is what specification does. You have a need, and now with specification, you're specifying that particular need and how you'd rather it solved, How you want it to be solved. And so if you're going to decide between which one to use, performance or conformance, then there are things you need to know about those two, all right? So let's start with the first one. With performance specification, the supplier can be innovative about the solution. It promotes competition in the marketplace. The supplier bears the risk. The buyer may not know exactly what they will be getting. The specification document is shorter and can be prepared faster. And performance specification takes advantage of suppliers' expertise. But if you decide to go with the other one, if you decide to go with the conformance or technical specification, then you need to understand that there is no supply innovation. There is reduced competition. As a buyer, you bear all the risks associated with the results. Buyers know exactly what they're getting. The document is complex and actually time-consuming to prepare, and it disregards suppliers' expertise. Why is that? Because with conformance, you're telling them what to do. And if you're telling them what to do, then it means they have to rely on what you know, which means if you don't know what you're talking about, then you'll get the results that pretty much reflect you not knowing what you're talking about, designed for you, okay? That is pretty much what is going to happen with that. Of course, the choice also depends on the nature of, the specification. For example, with technical machine parts, okay? Those ones, they have to conform with the designs that you've given them. But if it is something like coming up with, creative advertisement, then you may want the person who's doing that to get as creative as possible, as long as it doesn't ruin your brand. So the choice sort of just depends on those things. Yep, so let's talk about the second thing, or rather the second stage. Stage 2, market or commodity options. Once the specifications have been developed, then as a procurement professional, you are aware of what is required, why it's required, and when it is required. The next stage is to evaluate the market options. And the options to consider here will include budget available to spend on the procurement, the number of suppliers available, whether to make or to buy the product or service. You've done that. Let's assume that what you need is a commodity, okay? Then it means you need to research the market to understand the price behavior, the commodity price behavior. Commodity refers to raw material that can be bought or sold, for instance, coffee, gas, or even oil. Porter's 5 forces, okay, Michael Porter's 5 forces is an effective way of trying to understand the nature of competition that exists or is likely to exist in that market. And with Porter's, we're talking about the rivalry among the existing competitors in the market depends on the bargaining power of the buyers, bargaining power of suppliers, threat of substitute product or services, and how easy or hard it is for new entrants to get in that market. Now, the reason why you're evaluating this competition is pretty much obvious, or it is simple, because as a buyer, you get to find out if there are many suppliers battling to win the contract or a small number of specialists who could supply the product or service. Now, regarding the choice whether to make that thing or to simply buy, that just comes down to whether the item in question is actually core to whatever it is that you do. If it is something that is really integral to, whatever it is that your organization is doing or why you need it. A core competency within an organization is a product or service that is strategic to the success or failure of the business. Think of it this way. In a bakery business, core competency could be making cakes or bread. So the choice here is actually, should we buy these products from external suppliers or should we just make them ourselves? Carter's outsource matrix can help you to decide on the make or the buy decision. The idea behind this matrix is simple, okay? First, you look at items in terms of strategic importance and their contribution to operational importance. And this way, you end up with a quadrant, okay? And on the quadrant, you'll have the following. Items of low contribution and strategic importance, eliminate. Low contribution but high strategic importance. These call for strategic alliance. High contribution to operational performance. And high strategic importance, you want to retain these. And finally, low strategic importance but high contribution to the operational importance. This you can outsource, in this case, buy rather than make. So when you bring in products to the organization, you don't make them, you get them from outside. That is outsourcing. And the reason why you do this is because it saves money, reduces overhead, use of external knowledge, and it helps you to focus on internal competencies. But it's not all rainbow, okay, and sunshine and all that, right? There is also a disadvantage to outsourcing, and such could include things like losing some control within an organization, relying on external organization, reducing quality, and losing internal knowledge. Now, that is the thing with the second stage, okay? Let's move on to the third stage. Stage 3, develop strategy or a plan. Once the make or buy decision has been made and the market has been evaluated, the next stage is to develop the strategy or plan of how to achieve the procurement. You really need to be aware, or rather you really need to consider the external environment when you're making this decision. Conducting a competitive tender makes sense if there is competition in the market and you are in a position to leverage these. Now, both STEEPLE and SWOT analysis are good tools that you can use to analyze the environment in which your business exists in. With STEEPLE, you look at social, technological, economic, environmental, political, legal, and ethical factors which could affect what you need. On the other hand, if you decide to use the SWOT analysis, with SWOT, you're going to evaluate strengths. These are areas that perform well within the organization, for instance, key skill sets. Weaknesses, areas that need improvement, for instance, lack of resources. Opportunities, which are areas outside the organization that could contribute favorably or help with success. Threats, areas related to external factors which could pose problem to the organization. With SWOT, that's what it does. It helps you to look at what you have internally, basically your strengths and weaknesses, as well as externally, the opportunities and threats that the environment presents. And so let's move on to the next stage. Stage 4, pre-procurement market test and market engagement. This stage of procurement cycle ensures that it is the right time to carry out the procurement. Now, what are the things you should consider as a procurement professional? Stakeholders engagement for feedback, supplier engagement, market research, any new legislation or regulations, currency fluctuations, and competitors' action are some of the things to consider. If the feedback is positive, then you move on to the next stage of procurement. But what if the feedback is negative? Well, if the feedback is negative, as you're doing your the test, then you need to go back to your need specification. You need to go back to your need analysis. Look at the specifications to see if there is something you missed. Because it could be possible. If one of the stakeholders is giving you a negative feedback, then the question is, what is it exactly is it that they wanted that is not reflected in what you're about to procure? So you go back to the need specification and try to understand. You guys wanted laptops, and I'm about to procure these laptops. What is the problem? And then they tell you, look, we want laptops with these specifications because you're using them for graphic designs. The ones that you've just bought here, that you intend to purchase, or at least the ones that your specification indicates, yeah, they are good, but they're just good for typing and listening to music and doing that. The specs will not allow us to do the graphics. So, you sort of do that and you understand why there is a negative feedback. What could constitute negative feedback? Now, that is a good question, I mean, the laptop is an example, right? But some other things that could be part of the problem will include no desire in the marketplace for the end product, limited number of suppliers with capacity or capability, new laws about to be passed that will force specification changes, the currency is weak, competitors are already one step ahead. Those are some of the things which probably have nothing to do with the product itself, but the market. The point is, the negative feedback that you could get at this stage could depend on a number of factors, and it is important for you to understand that before you just rush head into the market and try to procure things. And then you end up wasting time, money, and not meeting the objectives or the scopes that you intended during the need assessment. So what is the next stage? Well, let's talk about the next stage. Stage 5, development of documentation. This stage of the procurement cycle involves creating the documents that will be sent out to the potential suppliers. Now, the document could be request for quotation or invitation to tender. The choice of what to use, the choice of which document to use actually depends on the following: the urgency of the need, the type of the need, the sector in which the procurement professional works, regulations and legal obligations, the procurement professional's preferred method of working. Generally, requests for quotations are used for quicker, less complex product or requirements, and tenders are used for long-term complicated contracts and services. Public sectors, for instance, will prefer using, tenders, right? But if you're just purchasing, or rather you're procuring privately from some supplier, they may just want a request for quotation, and that sort of is it, So the documentation that you're going to be using will include things like specification, So in this case, the content will be performance or conformance, contractual terms such as payment, exclusions, liabilities, indemnity, date of quotation, or bid to be received. So things like deadline for prices to be submitted, quantity, the amount of goods or service required, quality standards, conformance to any standard, e.g. ISO, delivery schedules, okay? When will goods or service be required? Delivery address, where will goods or service be delivered? Key performance indicators, okay, you have to show the objectives against which the suppliers will be monitored. Service level agreements, that is the standards of service the supplier will be expected to meet. When you're designing your documentations, you need to have those in mind, okay? When you're doing a quotation, what does it indicate? As you're developing your KPIs, what should it indicate? So those are some of the things that the documentations you're using are supposed to reflect. Now, stage 6, supplier selection. I don't want to just straight away send these documents to some random suppliers. You need to have the sort of suppliers that you want to work with in mind. Supplier selection involves evaluating suppliers against predetermined criteria to assess their suitability to work with the buying organization. Suppliers can be evaluated in a number of ways, such as competency, capacity, consistency, control, cost, commitment, cash, clean, culture, communication. I mean, if those sounds familiar, those are actually the Ray Carter's 10 C's of supplier evaluation, okay? So, those 10 things that you can use to evaluate your suppliers. Next stage is issue of invitation to tender or request for quotation. At this stage, the documentations that you had prepared at stage 5 are sent out to the pre-evaluated suppliers that you decided on in stage 6, okay? In public sector procurement, the documentation will be sent in one stage to a market of suppliers who have not been pre-selected. This is called open tendering. And if you decide to go with invitation to tender in such a case, then you want to ensure that all the suppliers get that at the same time, because again, you're avoiding things like bid rigging, and also you're trying to be fair. That is pretty much the thing with public sector procurement. I mean, it is always a good idea to give your suppliers an equal chance to take care of the problem. The next stage, stage 8, bid or tender or even quotation evaluation and validation. When the bids or quotations have been received by the buying organization, the next stage is to evaluate them. Basically look at them, okay, analyze so that you can decide which supplier you're actually going to award that contract to. To be certain that the potential supplier has offered a product or service that is fit for purpose, it is a good practice to work cross-functionally and involve other team members who have expert knowledge of the product or service, for instance, engineers, designers, or people who use or will use the product or service. So don't just focus on the price, because most of the time that is what people will look at. This supplier has a relatively cheap price compared to that one, and therefore let's go with that one. Well, the question is, what exactly do you want in this case? Okay? Because sometimes price is not even the main thing. At this stage, think of total cost of acquisition. The whole thing is like an iceberg in which all you see is the price. But beneath that, you have logistics and handling cost, customer service, training and support, inspection, basically a lot of other things, okay? A lot of other costs. And in fact, price is just one of the factors. So you need to pay attention to all that. Stage 9, contract award and implementation. At this stage, the supplier has been chosen, right? So now what? The procurement professional can now award the chosen supplier with the contract to supply. The two parties will then negotiate the contractual terms to reach a mutual agreement before signing the final agreement and starting the contract. In public sector procurement, once the contract has been awarded, you need to notify the other suppliers who did not make it, okay? Who did not qualify at this stage. The reason why you do that? Well, because of transparency. So they need to know that while their efforts were appreciated, the right person was actually awarded the contract. And the next stage. Stage 10, warehouse logistics and receipt. If the contract awarded is for tangible need, which is something that you can touch, okay? So that's what tangible needs are. Then the stores or warehouse department need to be involved to prepare for the arrival of the goods. The warehouse workers will need to allocate space for the products, expect deliveries, and understand specifications so that they can carry out quality checks accurately. Stage 11, contract performance review and continuous improvement. Yeah, a contract has been awarded, but you still need to manage that contract. In order to effectively manage supplier performance and contractual obligations, you should regularly review the supplier's performance against key performance indicators. Well, the KPI will obviously have been agreed upon before the contract was awarded and, when the negotiation was taking place. Continuous improvement is something else that the procurement team and suppliers need to work on. This will actually involve waste reduction and quality improvement on that supply chain. Identify, plan, execute, review is pretty much how the continuous improvement cycle works. Identify the opportunities in the process workflow, plan how the process can be improved, implement the changes, and review how the changes are working for the team. Of course, there is more to that, but for now, that will do, okay? You're summarizing things here. Now, the next stage, number 12, stage 12, supplier relationship or contract management. Managing the supplier relationship, okay, and the outcome of the contract is very important. The two do not automatically happen together. It's very possible to have a contract that is actually giving you the results that you want, but have a very poor, relationship with the supplier. So that can happen. The style of relationships required will depend on the strategic position of the product or service being procured. Of course, strategic product or service will demand a more, collaborative approach or a more collaborative sort of relationship with the supplier. And stage 13, asset management or end of life. At this point, the question is whether or not whatever was procured will be needed again. If the need is still current and unchanged, the procurement cycle process commences again, but from a different stage, since you already know what we need, okay? And we understand it, so we're not going to go through the whole need analysis again. It's just a rebuy, which could be, okay, if you have to change a few things, then it can be a modified rebuy. But it's not a new buy, okay? But if the need is not required after the contract end date, the procurement professional should manage the end of life by aiming to reduce stock levels and inform the suppliers that there will be no further requirement after the contract has ended. And that's pretty much how you deal with that. Now, those are 13 stages, okay? The procurement life cycles, 13 stages of them. If there is any question at this point, obviously, do let me know. I'm Moses, and I'll see you in the next video.